When we make multi-strand jewelry like necklaces and bracelets, we often use purchased metal spacer bars to keep the strands separate. But today I have for you a really cool trick for using beads to make your own spacer bars. Hi there, Sandy here. Welcome to another jewelry making video at keepsakecrafts.net. The benefit to making your own spacer bars out of beads is that you can make them any size, any length, and of course any color you want. For this project I'm using cube beads. You could do this stitch with any beads, but there's something very satisfying about the way the cubes snap together to make this shape. I think it just looks really cool and it works very effectively. These are some little 4mm cubes. For each of your spacer bars, for this size, for 5 4mm cubes, you're going to need about 15 inches of bead stringing thread. I'm using Wildfire. There are other brands out there, Fireline. Just use a color that goes with the colors of your beads. I'm using black today because it will show up less than white. The easiest way to do this is to have 2 beading needles. Pardon mine and all their crazy shapes. This is the way they end up after I work with them. You want to put 1 needle on each end of your thread. Once your needles are threaded, go ahead and pick up one of your beads. Slide 1 needle through from one side. Then slide the other needle through from the other direction, being careful that you don't pierce the thread. You'll be able to feel it if you do. Hold those 2 needles together and pull on the bead until it's centered on the thread. Now notice that right here on one side there will be a loop of thread going around the outside of the bead. We'll take care of that in a moment. Repeat to add another bead. Another way you can do this, and you'll be certain that you don't pierce the thread, is to put it on one needle and then put on the other needle. And now that way the needles don't even come near the thread. So there's no way you can pierce it if you have some thread that's maybe prone to being pierced. Now when you first pull this up, it's not going to behave for you. You have to fiddle with it a little bit. You'll need to turn that bead so that that bit of thread that's on the outside is on the inside. It's next to the second bead you added. And then just tug on both of those threads. Did I get it? No. There. So now that extra thread is just hidden on the inside. There's going to be thread showing on the sides. There's no avoiding that. And then repeat with your remaining beads. This is called the ladder stitch. It's often the basis for It's often the foundation for other bead embroidery and bead weaving projects. I am using 2 different beads here, mostly because this was all I had. So I think the middle ones are Swarovski crystals, and then the end ones are just ones that I got at the craft store. And they both work equally well. You could do this stitch with other beads. You could do it with seed beads. You could do it with round beads, although more of your thread will definitely show. It doesn't have to be cubes. But I just, like I said, thought it was very satisfying the way these fit together. And see how you just kind of have to fiddle with that there and make it behave. So I'm going to make a 3-strand bracelet, and I'm using just the middle and outer beads for my stringing holes. If I had bigger cubes, maybe I could have made more. You just have to test out what you have, what fits in the space, just like you would any multi-strand project where you test and see what spacing works best. Once you get to your last bead, take one of your needles and go back down through the previous bead. Keeping the thread, of course, on the same side. So see how it's loosened up there? This will tighten it up for you. And then repeat with the other needle, going back down through the previous bead and the other direction. And now when you pull on that, it should stay. Next, take one of your needles, go through that loop of thread, pull, but don't pull tight, leave a loop of thread and put your needle back through it. That is a half hitch knot. Pull that nice and snug, and then send your needle through the previous bead. And we're just going to make a series of 3 knots on each thread before finishing it off. Actually, we're not going to finish these off until we've done our stringing. If you've done any bead weaving, you'll know the more passes you make with the thread through a bead, the more naturally the hole fills up. So we don't want to fill our holes until we've gotten our beads on. So I'm just going to do another half hitch knot. Since this is kind of holding a piece of jewelry together, I do want to make sure that this is knotted securely. If you have a color of beads that maybe doesn't work well with the standard black or white, you can buy this thread in other colors. Another thing you can do is use a Sharpie marker to color white thread the way you want it. I've done that. It's a little tedious to color, a yard and a half of thread, but it does work. So here's my third half hitch knot on this side. If you've done any bead weaving, you'll recognize this is how we usually finish off bead weaving, is to go back through the stitching, making several half hitch knots as we go to make sure it's secure. So I'm going to leave these thread tails and not tie them off until the very end. So here are more of these spacer bars that I'm going to make, which means my bracelet's going to have 3 spaces. I did a little bit of math earlier to figure out just how long I need to make each of these gaps. I'm going to use this as a clasp, sewing it on at the very end. And I just did some math. I want to make my bracelet 7.5 inches long because I'm using some thicker beads. I need to make it a little longer than I might normally. This clasp will add 1.25 inches to my bracelet. So 7.5 minus 1.25 inches is 6.25 inches. Then I measured the width of these. These are going to add 1 inch to the length of my bracelet, so that leaves 5.25 inches. And if you divide 5.25 by 3, these 3 sections, each of these sections needs to be 1.75 inches. So do the figuring accordingly with the beads and supplies that you have. The beads I'm using today are these ones. These are 4mm Czech fire polish in Indian yellow opal. I just love the butterscotchy look. I thought they were so pretty. I'm just kind of doing something with some autumn shades. These ones are 6mm Czech glass druks with a luster finish, and I've forgotten, I seem to have lost the name of the color, but I'll have a link to it for you at the post. And then these are some 4mm agates that I think I just got at the craft store. So I'm putting together a whole bunch of just very fall shades that I thought were really pretty, and I thought this accented it well. Since I could only fit 3 strands with the spacer bars I wanted to use, and I wanted to use all 3 types of beads, I did a little test here to decide, did I want to alternate the 6mm druks with the fire polish or alternate the agates with the fire polish? And interestingly, I thought I would like this better, but once I got it done, I decided I liked this better. So it's always a good idea to do a bit of a test. And then I did a little bit of measuring out and figured out that 8 of these fire polish makes 1 3/4 inches. So that's what will be the center of my bracelet. You'll need to cut yourself some more beading thread. This is about 1.5 yards, and thread that onto a beading needle. You don't need to use a super fine beading needle here unless you're using beads with very small holes like seed beads, but none of these are seed beads, so just a regular beading needle will work. Just go through the center hole on one of my multi-spacer separators that I created and put this somewhere around the middle of my beading thread. Then, like I said, I'm going to add 8 of these Czech glass druks. There's 8, and there's my 1 3/4 inches. Then the center bead again of another spacer. Now you could do this on bead stringing wire if you wanted to, but I decided I just wasn't in the mood for dealing with like all the crimping on the ends, and I just thought that beading thread, since I was making these with beading thread, I would just go ahead and continue that. It would have required a little bit different engineering to do it with bead stringing wire. There's 8 again. Is that right? Yep. And 1 more of these, and repeat adding the beads. Okay, we've got our 3rd bundle of 8 on there, and add the 4th and final spacer bar. So there's the center of my bracelet. Now we can start adding in the ones on the other side, and actually my little sample came in very handy here because I was able to lay it down and determine that I needed, I think, 5 of each. 2, 3, 4, 5 was the same length to fit in between here. Move that out of the way. Here are my Czech fire polish, and here are the agates. At this point, I'm coming out of this center bead of my spacer bar, so I'm just going to try to get these tails out of the way. I'm just going to run my needle under this thread. Yeah. Just so I don't have a big huge loop going from here to here. So I just ran it under that one, and I'll do the same here, run it under. Now I can go through that outer hole and start adding my agates and fire polish alternating. And then run my needle through the outer hole, the spacer bar, and we'll just check and make sure that's the right length. Yeah. So I'll repeat until I've gone down to this end, adding 2 more sets of the fire polish and agates. Now I have 2 of my 3 strands on the bracelet done. It's time to add the 3rd strand, and I'm going to travel across the end of this spacer the same way I did on the other one. I just have further to go. So just go through that thread. Like I said, just so you don't have a really long loop of thread hanging out there that would catch on things and isn't all that attractive. So there. And then down through that outer hole, or whichever hole you need to do. Give it a tug so that it's pulled even. This one, of course, is the end that we left, so just leave that. Now you can repeat adding your remaining row of beads going up this way. And here I've finished adding the last section of my third row of beads. Pull that snug. And I have far more thread than I needed, so I probably only needed about a yard. You'll have to just calculate based though on the number of strands you're doing and the length they are, and then add in extra. I would much rather have to cut off a lot of extra than have not enough. Take a minute to make sure that everything is pulled up even, and then you can start making your half hitch knots in the spacer bar, just the way we finished off the threads for putting together the spacer bar. Just go down and through and do at least 3 half hitch knots on each end. You'll do that with this one too. Don't pull the thread so tight that your bracelet is stiff, but of course don't leave big gaping holes either. Once you've knotted this end like you were going to finish off the thread, then go ahead and add your clasp. I like to knot it like I'm finishing off the thread first, so that if I ever do need to change the clasp, if something happens, I can just cut the clasp off and not worry about having to take apart my entire bracelet because it was all attached together. So I'm going to start in the center here because this is pretty close to spaced around those 3 center beads, but maybe not perfectly. So I want to start in the center so that it ends up centered. I'll travel over to the other bead, the next bead, and up through that hole and back down. I'll go back up through the center. This is loose because remember this hasn't been finished off down this end. We'll get to that. This is the second pass through that middle loop. And then up here through this one. And I'm noticing that my clasp has a definite right side and back side, so I want to make sure I put it on with both right sides facing the same direction. And I'll go back and do this one again, come back, so that each of these has at least 2 passes of thread going through it. The center one will have 3 or 4, and that's good. That'll be nice and secure. Then once that's done, you can take your needle off and finish off this end the same way. And when you're all done with all of your stitching, then I would recommend that you take this. This is super new glue. It's a super glue. It's cyanoacrylate like super glue, but it's much thinner. What I like about that for beading is that it travels down the thread and really gets down to the centers of the bead holes. So what I'm going to do is finish off these tails by putting a drop of this. And you can see how thin it is. It just travels right in there. And I didn't want to do this before I was done with all the stringing because then you might not be able to string into these holes. See, it's very thin. It just disappears. So you let it dry and then trim off your thread tails and you're all done. So I hope that you take this idea and run with it and make your own multi-spacer bars out of beads of different shapes and sizes, and it really opens up a whole new area of design possibilities. Thank you so much for your support. Happy creating. Bye-bye.